Hey everybody, Ryan here at eTrailer. Today on our 2016 Nissan Pathfinder, we're going to be showing you how to install the airlift air helper springs for the rear axle. Before we get into that though, let's just take a minute, check these out, and make sure they're going to work for you. What we like to do before we actually put the air springs on is do some before and after testing. So right now we got the factory suspension. We put a cargo carrier back here, loaded up some weight, enough to get our vehicle to squat down a little bit, and we'll run through our test course, get a good baseline and see how it does. So here inside the vehicle, first thing I noticed is when I sat down, we're tilted up a little bit. Not the ideal way to drive, but maybe that's just me, and we don't even have that much weight back there really, so you can imagine if you're pulling a heavy camper or something like that, it'd probably be a lot worse. But what we'll do first is go over some bumps and get a little energy going through the chassis here. And it's about how I expected, honestly. It's not terrible by any means, but it's definitely soft. You can feel the suspension. It doesn't have the travel that you'd want it to. You go over the bump, you kind of feel it come down kind of hard, and then it gets sloppy. It's just you're kind of floating around. It's taking a while to recover. And so, hopefully with the additional support that we get from the air springs should help combat that and make our suspension not have to work as hard and be a little more comfortable and more responsive. What we'll do now is some evasive maneuvering, and usually this is where you can tell a pretty big difference with all vehicles and air springs, to be honest with you. So what I'll do is pick up some speed and start to kind of turn aggressive, and not as bad as what I was thinking. Then again, just we don't have a ton of weight back there, but you can still feel it. There's a decent amount of body roll to when you turn. The vehicle wants to lean, and that weight isn't helping. It's making it push harder. And because of that, you have to slow down a little bit more, be more deliberate, and kind of crank the wheel to get you going back in the right direction. So hopefully these springs will combat that, help keep our vehicle a little more planted and pointed where we want it to go. So now we have our air springs installed, and I loaded up that same amount of weight on the back of the Pathfinder. Visually, I can tell that it's not squatting as much as what it was without the springs, so that's a good sign. But what really matters is how it's going to perform, how it's going to feel. So let's hop back in and run through the same tests. Back inside of our car, it feels better just sitting in here. We're not pointed way up. But we'll run through our bumps here and see how it feels. So, going over the first couple, and actually a lot better than, it's working a lot better than I was anticipating. It's a lot more responsive. Before the car is kind of floating around and super sloppy. Now it kind of hits that bump, recovers, and goes right back to its kind of natural position there. So definitely an improvement over our bumps, at least in my opinion, and that even kind of translates to the steering I'm feeling as well. Because before you'd hit the bump and, like I said, kind of floating sloppy, the steering wheel would kind of mimic that, and now you feel that initial kind of jar through the vehicle, through the wheel, and that's it. So like I said, definitely an improvement in terms of our bump scores. Moving on to our slalom course, we'll run through the test again, and so I'm gonna kind of get a little more aggressive this time, and definitely an improvement. As far as this goes, I'd say probably half the amount of body roll I was feeling before. A little bit easier steering, kind of similar to our bumps there, and that's due to our suspension having more support. Instead of the vehicle leaning and then trying to fight itself back up, it's not able to lean down as much because of that support, which keeps it more planted and going straight. Now that we've went around our test course and see how these actually feel, I figured it'd be useful to get the car up in the air and we can see them underneath the vehicle. And this is how they're going to look. They simply just go in your existing coil spring, and that's how they're going to provide the additional support. And these are going to be good for up to 1,000 pounds of load carrying capacity. Keep in mind though, that's not going to increase your vehicle's carrying capacity. That's just how much weight these can handle. These are going to be adjustable from 5 to 35 PSI, so you can kind of dial them in and find that perfect ride you're looking for depending on what you're towing or what you're carrying. And the way they're going to be able to do that, since they sit inside of the coil spring, say if these weren't in place, your OEM spring is going to be responsible for carrying the majority of the weight that you have on the back of your Nissan. All right, and by adding the air spring in there, essentially you're putting a helper spring in there to help kind of take some of that load off of your coil spring and provide additional support. Just to compare these to some of the other options available, there's a Firestone air spring that essentially works very, very similar to this setup here. And to be honest with you, not really a whole lot of differences. I don't really see any major advantages or disadvantages compared to these. So really can't go wrong either way there. There's another style of enhancement as well. It's the Sumo spring. And those are almost like a special piece of rubber type material that actually kind of fits in between the coils and kind of wraps around with it. It's not a bag or a spring that goes inside. And those seem to work out pretty well. The thing is with them, they're not adjustable. So you kind of get what you get. And, they potentially could stiffen up the ride when you don't really want it to be or don't need that support. So that's something to think about. With that said though, those style are going to be maintenance free. You're not going to have to do anything with them once they're in place. With an air spring like this, it is going to require that you have at least 5 pounds of air in it at all times. And so that's something you'll have to keep an eye on. And that's just for safety reasons. This bag is designed to operate within those parameters of air pressures. And to make that a little bit easier, I guess you could say, not that it's a huge deal, but you can pick up onboard compressor systems that will let you kind of adjust the pressures on the fly and kind of automatically maintenance the bags every time you get in the vehicle. With that said though, if you end up using one of those, make sure you don't exceed that 35 PSI rating that these have, because a lot of those compressors will go all the way up to 100 plus PSI. So definitely don't want to inflate them that much, but installing something like that on this vehicle will definitely make it a little bit easier and a little more user-friendly when you go to adjust your bags. At the end of the day, a quick and effective way to be able to provide your Pathfinder with a little more support. As far as getting these installed, really not too bad, to be honest with you. You let your suspension hang down, that way you have a lot more room to work in here. You kind of fold up the spring, put it inside of the coil spring and run your line. So shouldn't take up a ton of your time or give you too many issues, but if you'd like to see how that's done, feel free to hang around. We'll go ahead and get started on them now. To begin our installation, the first thing that we need to do is take our air spring here and kind of scrunch it down. So there's a rubber plug on the top of it. Pop that off and keep it close by. And what you want to do is try to work pretty much all the air out of it and kind of fold it up like a taco or a hot dog bun, and then put that cap back on, and that'll keep this in the proper shape so we can get it actually in our coil spring. Now we can move under our vehicle, and you want your suspension to be hanging down. That way it'll open up our coil spring and we'll be able to slide our air spring in. So when you're doing this at home, make sure you jack your vehicle up by the frame. That way the suspension will hang like this. All right, and use all the safety precautions, jack stands and wheel chocks and things like that. But this is going to slide in there, and you want the fitting to be facing down. So really no special way to do this. Just gonna kind of do our best here to work it in. Once you have that air spring in the coil, you can take this little spacer cushion that they give you and just slide it in. That way the air spring will have something to rest on. At this point, we can remove our rubber cap and let that spring fill up full of air. And of course, you can kind of, position it to how you want and make sure it's setting there properly. We can focus on our airline now, and when you get this, you want to make sure that end's going to have a good, clean, straight cut, so you can use a tool like this or a razor knife and push it down. That way we get the best sealing properties. But we'll go ahead and kind of prep it. They give you these little clamps. Take a pair of pliers, open it up, and we're just going to run it through maybe an inch or so. That way it'll make it a lot easier when we push this on the air spring. We can just run that right up to it. Where our air fitting, the barb fitting, comes down out of our bag, this will simply just push over it. Make sure it's pushed all the way up. And then we'll simply just work our clamp into position to hold that line, hold the line on. So I got our airline routed towards the back, and I just followed what the instructions suggest. Use zip ties to kind of run it up the control arm here. Leave some slack in it though, because this part does move, so you don't want it super tight. And you don't want to, wrench down on these zip ties and pinch the airline either, and prevent air from going in. So just run it up along through here, and it kind of goes on top of our evap canister there, where it drops down. Eventually I'm going to mount our fittings up right here. So I just left a little bit of extra line to work with, cut the remainder off. That way we could use it for the passenger side. On the passenger side, the air spring and everything's going to install the exact same way as the driver's side. So get that one in. Your airline comes down. Really the only difference with this side is they give you a thermal sleeve here. Just slide that over the line. That helps keep it protected from the heat of the exhaust. But the line's going to come up and over and kind of run up along through here, and then coming over towards our other airline here. What we can do now is kind of prep our T-fitting here, and we're doing this because we're going to run the passenger side airline into here, driver side airline into here, and we're just going to have one inflation valve. That way the bags will fill up at the same pressures and at the same rate. They give you two of these, so you don't have to use a T. You could always just put this on the individual airline. To me, I'd rather them have the same pressures and be a little bit easier. Probably better performance too, but that's your choice. So what I did is took probably a 6-inch piece of airline, slid it over our T, put on our clamp, and we'll do the same thing on this end. But for the Schrader valve, it's pretty much the same deal. Take one of the nuts, thread that on, and then that barb fitting, that line will just push right over it. We'll clamp this down just like the others. And so what I'll do now is our passenger and driver side lines, I'll cut them the length and plug them in the same way on each end of our T there. So here's how our deal looks. Like I talked about, two lines, just push on them fittings, and that's what we come up with. So Where we're gonna mount our stem is pretty cool. We'll come up here to our bumper. There's this push pin fastener. You can just take a flathead screwdriver and kind of pry that out. And then what we'll do is take the star washer, put that over. Then I'm gonna come in from the back here. And simply just push it down through that opening. And with that hanging down, you can take one of the rubber washers that they give you. Push that down flat. And then take the flat washer and a nut. And we'll tighten this up. You can use a 1/2-inch socket to snug this up. I usually don't even put a wrench or nothing on it. I just do it by hand to get it snug. Now what we can do is inflate our air springs to 30 PSI. That way we can check for any leaks or clearance issues. With pressure in our air spring system now, you want to come back and spray down every fitting connection point with soapy water to check for leaks. What you don't want to see is bubbles continuously and rapidly forming. If you see that, you know you got a leak. In our case, we're in good shape. You don't have that happening, so we know everything is sealed. If you do run into that though, let all the air out of the system, come back, take your clamp off, pull it off the fitting, recut the line, and just redo it and check it again. And you don't want to see a leak. And that'll finish up our look at and our installation of the Airlift air helper springs for the rear axle on our 2016 Nissan Pathfinder.